character. I don't like to say from a Bible story. I like to say from a biblical account, because these are real accounts. These things really happened. And so this is a biblical character from an account that happened. And a lot of you may have heard lessons about this individual before, or maybe many times. I haven't. But I've always been impressed with this individual. He's really a character that you don't give a lot of thought to when you study the main, what we consider the bigger lesson. It's found in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and chapter 12. The story that we'll be, the account that we'll be considering is from chapter 2 Samuel 11, and we're going to be studying about Uriah the Hittite. And I'm not going to go through and talk about David and Bathsheba, just only to the extent that it helps us in our study of Uriah. And when we think about Uriah, we'll find in him as we study that he was a person of self-denial. Sometimes we think about people that are temperate or have self-control. I think those are closely related, but I also see some distinction between self-denial and self-control, although they may be overlapping at times. He is a person of great courage. He's a person that has a strong dedication to a cause. Although he only makes a brief statement that's covered in one verse, we can learn volumes about Uriah the Hittite. And his Hebrew name is Flame of God. Flame of God. Now, I'm going to read just a few verses. We know very well, I would assume everyone in here, or practically everyone in here, knows the account of David and Bathsheba. But I'm going to read verses that pertain to Uriah the Hittite as exclusively as I can. And I'm going to begin reading in chapter 6, in chapter 11, beginning in verse 6 through verse 16. And David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah was come unto him, David demanded of him how Joab did, and how the people did, and how the war prospered. And David said to Uriah, "Go down to thy house and wash thy feet." And Uriah departed out of the king's house, and there followed him a mess of meat from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with the servants of his lord, and went not down to his own house. And when they had told David, saying, "Uriah went not down unto his house," David said unto Uriah, "Comest thou not from thy journey? Why then didst thou not go down to thine house?" And Uriah said unto David, "The ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go into mine own house and eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As thou livest and as thy soul livest, I will not do this thing." And David said to Uriah, "Tarry here today also, and tomorrow I will let thee depart." So Uriah abode in Jerusalem that day and the morrow. And when David had called him, he did eat and drink before him, and he made him drunk. And at even he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his Lord, and he went not down to his house. And it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, set ye Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. And it came to pass, when Joab observed the city, that he assigned Uriah unto the place where he knew that valiant men were. Okay, and now let's read verses 22 through 24. So the messenger went. Now, what transpired in between here are the actual events that took place in Uriah's death. But in verse 22, we pick up, so the messenger went and came and showed David all that Joab had sent for him. And the messenger said unto David, surely the men prevailed against us, and came out into the field, and we were upon them unto the entering of the gate. And the shooters shot from the wall unto thy servants, and some of the king's servants be dead, and thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So that's what happened concerning Uriah. He was going to be used to try to cover sin. He would not cooperate as David had expected him to. He carried his own death sentence back with him to the battlefield, where he was killed fighting courageously, and it was reported back to King David what had happened. First of all, let's note, and I've just got these 3 points, of course. Let's talk about self-denial. In reading this account, would anyone have thought anything about Uriah going down to his own house after being off at war, coming home, having the opportunity to go to his home and be with his wife? Most people wouldn't have thought anything about it, I suppose. But Uriah did. He denied himself that opportunity. And he explains why, which we'll talk about later in greater detail. He certainly was a man that did not put himself first. There were greater things than satisfying himself. He denied himself those opportunities. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 27, in the King James Version, he says, I bring my body under subjection, lest after I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. I know years ago when I taught the Sunday morning Bible class, some may remember that on many occasions I would exhort that we needed to get self out of the way. When we can get self out of the way, we can do away with a lot of problems. We can get away with a lot of problems with ourselves to begin with in our relationship with God. But we can do away with a lot of problems with our fellow Christians, with our neighbors, with those in the world, those that we would want to influence for good, if we would only get self out of the way. Now, the Apostle Paul, whether he was referring to self-discipline or if he was referring to being temperate or self-controlled in this particular verse, it's hard for me to distinguish, or if he was talking about denying self. I think the point is the same, is that we have to get self out of the way. I don't think there's any question when we look at Matthew chapter 20, beginning in verse 25, even the apostles, after the mother of James and John went to Christ asking that one of her sons sit on Christ's right hand and the other on the left hand, the other 10 became upset about that. And then you see here this idea of wanting to be exalted. They were not concerned about one another. They were not concerned about themselves, where they should have been concerned about one another. So when we read, beginning in verse 25, it says, "And Jesus called unto him and said, You know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you, but whosoever shall be great among you, will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many." We have a hard time learning that lesson of self-denial, of putting others before ourselves. Uriah understood there were things that were more important than satisfying what he may have wanted to do. We need to learn that same lesson. We need to learn to get self out of the way. And over in 1 John chapter 2, beginning in verse 15, these are all passages that we're familiar with, and many can still quote these. But this is a passage that we will read for emphasis and make a couple of points. First John 2, beginning in verse 15, it says, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of the Father abideth forever." You see, the problem is this: there's too many things in the world. There's too many things, that we lust after, we have desire for. There's too many things that I want that make me happy, or I think that they will make me happy. And so we have to deny ourselves these things. Now, these things that are referred to here in 1 John chapter 2, beginning in verse 15, these things no doubt have reference to things that are sinful. When it's talked about love not the things, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world, is having reference to things that are, in my opinion, would be sinful, but we can love things that are not what considered sinful. We can have a desire for those things because it's what I want. We've got to get self out of the way. We've got to learn self-denial. And if it's the way that Uriah exhibited his self-denial, denying self, because there was something greater. And certainly there's something greater for us. As I said, we'll discuss that in just a few minutes. Does anyone would like to add to that? Any comments that anyone would like to make? Any other scriptures or points that someone would like to bring out?
Gerald, here we just read in 1 John 2:15, which says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. I mean, it's referring to, I guess it could be anything, right? I mean, that's kind of the idea. You think fear love not the things of the world, and we all kind of use the terminology sometimes. Oh, I love my car, or I love this, and it's not in that sense. I don't think. Maybe this is a different kind of love that he's talking about. Your love not the things in the world. The things we can like and enjoy, but have a real love for. That seems to be what this is talking about here, or am I missing something?
Well, I think that it's primarily talking about, I think I stated or tried to state that what's under consideration here would be the world is considered, love not the things of the world is considered, would be considered in my mind, in this context, things that are sinful, and yet there could be things that are not sinful that we could have a strong desire for that would take us away from our affection toward things that are right. And in other words, we can make basketball our idol. Our love could be for the game of basketball, and that's of the world. But as far as I know, I love a good basketball game, but that can't be what, I shouldn't say I love it, but I enjoy watching a good basketball game, but I better not love it in this sense or in any sense.
And that's so really it's talking about your love, thinking the things of the world. So it's referring more to the sinful things of the world here.
Well, I think in this context it is. I stand to be corrected, but I believe in this context it's talking about, that we it's giving. If we took the whole context of this chapter and we bring it down to this part here, and especially, and it says, and the world passes away and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. There's a contrast there. So I think it's talking, he's telling us about don't love things of the world, don't love sinful things, but my point is we could take it to the point that we would, things that are not sinful in and of themselves, we can give too much attention to, that we would be doing wrong. Anyone want to add to that? Yeah, that's a good illustration.
And then verse 16, all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life.
And I've heard people use that analogy, and I don't know if it's a correct analogy, but they use that and apply it to Eve in the garden. That she had those three were applicable to her. Now, whether that's so or not, I don't know, but they've used that. But let's go on from self-denial to the courage that Uriah had. And we see the courage that he had when I can visualize Uriah fighting valiantly. Put him with the valiant men, the men that they're going to fight. And so they came out against him and they fought him right up to the gate. And then the archers from the wall shot and killed others, Uriah and others. But for sure, you make sure that Uriah is killed. I can see how valiant he was in battle. You think that when he was in the heat of the battle and they withdrew and there were not as many there, that Uriah started backing up and started looking over his shoulder and starting to turn and go away. No, he fought to the end. Now, I know this is a different dispensation, and things are different now. We don't fight with swords and so on. But it reminds me of Revelation 2:10b. Be thou faithful unto death. I believe he was faithful unto death. He was a courageous man. And there's an interesting reading, and I'm not going to read the entire reading, but the passage in 2 Samuel 23, beginning with verse 8 and going through verse 39. But verse 8 says, now these are the mighty men whom David had. And then the last verse, verse 39 says, and Uriah the Hittite, and there were 37 in all. So they name these men, and it tells some of the things that some of the men did, and some it just gives their name. But on the last verse, it says, and Uriah the Hittite, and there were 37 in all. So of the mighty men of David, Uriah the Hittite is named as one of only 37 men. You think he was a courageous man? Now he wanted to get back to the battle. It's what he wanted. He wanted to get back to the battle because he was fighting for, who was he fighting for? Now we're going to get into this more, but he was fighting for his fellow soldiers. He's fighting for Joab. He was fighting for David, his king. He's fighting for God. Mentions the ark. You know, he was fighting for those things, and we're going to talk on that in more depth in a minute. But he was a man of courage. He was not afraid. And when he became outnumbered, I'm satisfied that they knew he wouldn't turn and run. They knew that he would stand and fight and therefore be killed. And he is mentioned as one of 37 of David's mighty men. And he was up there fighting with men of valor. We need to be courageous, just as David, just as Uriah was courageous. One of my most favorite verses in the Bible is found in Numbers chapter 13 and verse 30. And this is where the 12 spies go into the land of Canaan to spy it out. And we know what happens. 10 come back with a report of how bountiful the land is, but there's no way we can overtake it because they're like giants and we're like grasshoppers in their sight. And Caleb says, let us go up at once and overtake it, for we are well. Let us go up at once, for we are well able to overtake it. Now, he was courageous. And there was a reason for that. He had faith and trust, and he knew that God was on his side. You know, let us go up at once and possess it. I'll get it right this time. Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overtake it, or maybe overcome it. That was one of the Bible verses that we studied with the children at home when we were studying years and years and years ago. And I've always been impressed by that verse of the courage that Caleb had. And it wasn't a blind courage. It was something that was based on his understanding of the situation, his understanding of what he had seen that God could do and did do. And then we can see, and I'm not going to go and read these, but in Acts chapter 4, verses 19 and 20, this is the first time the apostles are taken, and they're threatened not to teach anymore in the name of God, in the name of Christ. And again in chapter 5 and verse 29, I think it's there, they say, you judge, is it right for us to, and one of the two, it's you judge, is it right for us to obey God or to obey you. I'm moving ahead because I see I'm running out of time already. But the point being, these were not idle threats by those that had them in captivity, those that had them before them and threatening them, because it wasn't long after that they beheaded James, and Peter was next in line uh, until the angel came and loosened the chains and let him out. So these were men of courage. And so we need to be courageous. We don't need, you know, Caleb and Joshua were in the minority. We're going to be in the minority if we're courageous. If we have the courage to stand and speak for Christ and to stand up and let people know who we are and what we stand for, and do it in love, do it the way we ought to, it's going to take courage. It may cost us some things. It will cost us some things. But the reward will be worth it. But it's going to take courage to do that. It took courage for the apostles to do it, and it cost them some things. It cost them all. John, the disciple who Christ loved, it seems to be historically is the only one that we don't know that was a martyr. But the point I'm making is Uriah was one that was very courageous, and we've got to be courageous as well. And I'm going to spend the last third on what I think is, to me, the most profound statement one of the most profound statements that I've ever read, and I'm going to read it again. And that is a person that is dedicated to a cause. If we're dedicated to a cause, then we won't have a problem with self. We won't have a problem with courage. If we're dedicated to the cause of Christ, like Uriah was dedicated to his cause, then we'll be selfless and we'll be courageous, and there won't be anything that will hold us back from doing what we ought to do. And so I'm going to flip back to 2 Samuel chapter 11, and let's listen to these words again that Uriah says. And Uriah said unto David, the ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go into mine house and eat and drink and lie with my wife? As thou livest and as thy soul liveth, I will not do this thing. Can we say that? Can we say words like, and I'm not going to be able to do it as well as Uriah. Can we say to someone, God is in heaven, he's the creator of the earth and all things and the sustainer of all things. The Lord Jesus Christ shed his precious blood for me. My brothers and sisters in Christ endure trials and temptations. They suffer pain and agony and burdens that they bear. Am I going to give in to everything that comes my way? Am I going to put myself before? Am I going to put my wants and my wishes before things that are right? Am I going to not sacrifice as I ought to? Am I going to be so weak that I won't stand with them? You know, in 1 Peter chapter 5, it talks about the devil walking about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. You know, it goes on. If you read that, it says that it refers to that the brethren are enduring the same thing. We're not alone in this. Are we going to be the ones that shirk back when it comes time to stand up, to be strong? Are we going to be the ones that are selfless, or are we going to be the ones that's selfish? Are we going to love our brethren and show our love and encourage and help people? Are we going to deny ourselves? And are we going to be, as he is here, are we going to be totally committed to the cause of Christ, no matter what it takes? Are we willing to give our lives, if necessary, for the cause of Christ, as Uriah did? He didn't know what was happening, but I guarantee you, if he knew that he was going to lose his life, he would have done the same thing, I believe. What kind of commitment do we have? In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, there the Apostle Paul says, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Can we say that and mean it? Does that describe me? That the life that I now live is not the life that I did live, but I have been crucified with Christ. And it's Christ that lives in me. It's Christ that loved me and gave himself for me. Am I that committed? Does that sound like me? When you read those verses, does it sound like you? In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 21, beginning, this is the verse that's hard for me to understand because I don't think I'm there yet. But if we begin reading in Philippians 1 and verse 21, it says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. I'm not sure that I've got that much confidence yet. I believe that, I know I obeyed the gospel. I know that my sins were washed away. I believe that I have hope of life eternal, but I don't think I've got as much confidence as Paul is showing here. And he goes on to say, for if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor, yet what I shall choose, I won't not. For I am in a strait between two, having the desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. That's a lot of confidence. That's a lot of confidence. Then he goes on to say, nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. If I understand that, he's saying, I'm ready to go ahead and die and to be with Christ. I'm ready to go. He's saying it with confidence. But he says, I'm in a hard place. I want to go and be with Christ, which is better. But I'm still needed here. The brethren need me. And so what I want, which is to be with Christ, is one thing, but the brethren need me. I'd rather be with Christ, but I got responsibilities. This is where we need to get to where we can say that without any apprehension, I guess we could say. And I'm just being totally honest. Not that I know that there's any sin in my life. If I did, I'd be repenting of it right now. I'd be calling on somebody to pray for me. But I'm just saying, look at the confidence. I sort of say boldness. I guess you could call it boldness, but it's confidence that Paul has. And then in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, I know this is the book of faith, what we call it talks about all the faithful and all that they did, but I'm going to move over to the second part of that, where they're not naming people, and beginning in verse 32. Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 32, and then I want to come back and note something in particular, but I'm going to read 32 through verse 40. And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah and of David also and of Samuel and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the enemies, the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword, they were wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. And it goes on to describe them more. But I'm going to go back to verse 35b. This is, when I read this, it just touched me. 35b. And it says, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. They were tortured, and they could have been delivered from that torture, but they did not accept deliverance. They endured that torture. They were committed to the cause of Christ, that they would not accept deliverance from their torture. We've not been tortured. One other verse, and I'll be finished. In 2 Timothy, in verse 7, the Apostle Paul, at the end of his life, 2 Timothy chapter 4, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7. Now this commitment to a cause is a lifetime commitment. The Apostle Paul made that commitment. He said, I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Have we made a lifetime commitment? Are we keeping that commitment? Are we kind of in and out? Are we committed today and then next week we kind of get off track? We're committed for a month or two and then we kind of wander off. We lose that zeal. We lose that, we forget what God has done for us. That's what happened in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. What he's going to tell us about Sunday. They forgot what God had done for them, and therefore they needed to take heed lest they fall. So that's a second bell. So let's deny self, let's be courageous, and let's be steadfastly committed to the cause for which we've been called. Thank you for your attention.